Hello, Gen Con. I'm your host, Brian Holland from Chaosium, and welcome to Horror on the Tabletop. We are all super psyched to be here and have each and every one of you joining us from all around the globe. For many of us, horror holds a special place in our hearts. It allows us to explore stories through a unique lens that taps into something primal within each of us. And horror is a polarizing genre, and it can be hard to really articulate why we enjoy engaging in something that makes us feel frightened. In fact, the subject of horror and horror storytelling, particularly in games, lends itself to a plethora of questions, often with multiple answers. So tonight, myself and our panel seek to answer some of those questions as we explore what I personally believe is the best genre to play at your tabletop. We'd love for each of you to join in on the conversation tonight. I'll be choosing some of your questions throughout the night to pose to our panelists. To ask a question or get involved in the conversation, simply tweet using the hashtag GenConHorror. So that's hashtag GenConHorror on Twitter with any discussions or questions you may have. Before we really dive into the meat of our conversation, I just want to go around and meet each of our panelists. And I'd like to ask each of them, what was their first horror gaming experience and what is it that they personally love about horror? So let's start with Amanda. So tell us a bit about yourself, what you do in the industry, and then how horror got its claws in you. Its proverbial claws, one hopes.
Hi, so my name is Amanda Hamon. I am the editorial director over at Kobold Press. I'm also an author, a writer, a designer, a developer for a number of different types of games. People may be most familiar with my work for Paizo on Starfinder, which I co-created as a system and the setting, and also on Pathfinder, both first and second edition. I have been playing and loving horror for most of my life. Some of my earliest tabletop RPG experiences involved horror, and I had a particularly memorable game that I actually ended up playing in hell in some of an early homebrew system in which we were PCs who were trapped within the depths of hell, having to figure out how to unlock the different gates to get ourselves out. So that's been a genre that I've enjoyed for the longest time across all types of media, and most of my writing ends up being a horror type of experience, even if I don't necessarily intend it to be. I love gothic horror, and I love horror in space, and I love body horror and all sorts of different things. So that's my spiel.
Do you recall, Amanda, what your first horror tabletop experience was?
Yeah, it was definitely that game that took place in hell as the PCs woke up from having a very raucous night at a tavern. That was kind of the early sort of session zero of play, and as we woke up, we slowly realized that our surroundings were a version of our worst nightmares. And so I was very young. I was a teenager at the time, and so that was kind of one of my first experiences of like the thing that the DM is setting up as the conceit of the game is not necessarily the direction that it's going to go. So I was just really hooked at that point of like, this unexpected experience can, just kind of really like make an experience that is just kind of like cerebral and really kind of off-putting and all of that. It was a very early formative experience.
Next, Thomas. Or Tomas?
Thomas
is fine.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about who you are, what you do in the industry, and what you love so much about horror, if you do, assuming you do, and that I've chosen you correctly.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name is Tomas Harenstam. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Free League Publishing, and one of the lead designers of the Alien RPG that came out last year alongside Andrew Gaska and some other people. So I'm also we recently released a new horror game called Vesen. It's about Nordic horror, based in Nordic folklore. So I'm been working on that as well. So that's kind of my role, I guess. Yeah, and horror games have been with me. I mean, I've been almost as long as RPGs have been with me. I think the very first horror RPG experience was there was a Swedish translation of the horror game Chill that came out in the 80s. I played probably the first one. It was like a haunted house story. That was fine, but I think the big impression, the first horror game that really sunk its teeth into me was a Call of Cthulhu scenario that my brother GM'd for me and some other some other people, and it was I think it was called The Nightmare in Norway. I mean, it was one of those 80s games, and we just felt, at that time, I think we felt it was really cool that it was set in, not Sweden, but Norway. It was like close enough, and we just figured that was amazing. And that whole thing of horror in the darkness and the snow and in the woods, just kind of, that was a strong experience. And I was like 11 or 12 years old at that time, so I think that might have helped as well. So I never forgotten about that. So that's probably the first really big horror RPG experience that I had.
It's great how those sort of things stay with us for a really long time. Amanda
Yeah.
said that your first one was when you were in your teens as well, right? So we tend not
Yep.
to forget those formative years. Next, let's hear from Crystal.
Hi, I'm Crystal Mazur. I am a writer and game designer. I worked on Chicago by Night. I wrote the history section for Chicago by Night from Onyx Path. I am the line developer for Pip System from Third Eye Games. And I wrote on Snowhaven and Never Going Home from Wet It Games, and a whole bunch of other stuff that's coming out that I can't talk about right now. But my very first dive into horror, actually, I worked at a haunted house for 17 years, and I started when I was in middle school. And that kind of drove me to try to find other like avenues of experiencing different types of horror, and that led me to Vampire the Masquerade in high school. And so Vampire was my very first role-playing game, and I still play it with the people that I played with in high school, though not as frequently as, you know, when we had a lot more free time. But I absolutely love like the suspense within horror. I enjoy multiple different types of horror: body horror, suspense horror, psychological horror, splatter horror, B-movie horror. That, like, all of that stuff is just really fun and interesting and intriguing, and very inspirational for me.
Excellent. And last on our panel, but certainly not least, Mr. Mike Mason. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about what you do in this industry.
Hi, well, I'm in my day job. I'm the creative director for Call of Cthulhu at Chaosium. For my sins, I co-wrote the latest edition of Call of Cthulhu, the tabletop role-playing game. I also co-wrote the first Warhammer 40,000 role-playing game, Dark Heresy. And I've been into horror a long time. I started by, well, I grew up in 1970s Britain, so every day was a horror story, not least of which public information films for children about the dangers of playing on building sites and playing with water. Which you can watch on YouTube, by the way, The Spirit of Dark Water. Go and watch it. So we got introduced to horror at a very early age in school. I've been reading horror stories before I was in my teens. The first horror game I played was Jaws. You know, the one that's a bit like Buckaroo, where you got the mouth of the shark full of junk and you have to pick it out. That was closely followed by The Haunted Mansion, where you drop a marble into the Haunted Mansion, and I just loved it. And then I got into role playing, and in 1981, well, probably more like 1982, Call of Cthulhu came out, and that was the first tabletop RPG that was a horror game. It's the first one I played, and I've been playing it ever since. It hooked me straight away. I've been playing many other types of games before then, mainly, running around dungeons and hitting things. And then I discovered a game where there was a story, and then I was completely hooked. And the fact that it had a story and it was a horror game was, gold dust to me. So that's really what got me started, and that's what I still do to this day.
A very enviable position. So I said at the start of the top of the panel that I'm Brian Holland. I'll be the host for tonight. I said that I work for Chaosium. I also work for Paradox Interactive on the World of Darkness team, so working with Vampire the Masquerade across a number of different products and stuff, which is exciting. In terms of myself, my first horror game was also my first role-playing game, which was actually Vampire the Masquerade. back in about 2005. And did I say Vampire the Masquerade? I should have said Vampire the Requiem. Is in 2005. I did, right? Sorry, I'm still sleeping.
They're very different games.
It was a very different game. No, it's an important distinction to make that I like making because there's a lot of amongst the vampire community, it's a very polarizing thing. But I like to remind people that while I'm entrenched in Masquerade now to the point that I actually work for the company that is producing it, I actually got my hooks into it with Requiem, I still, my endeavor in life is to be able to articulate why I enjoy horror when I can't think of anything worse than being frightened alone in dark at night. I don't understand it. Maybe one day I will. Maybe we'll figure it out tonight. We don't know. So let's move along to our sort of first topic. I'd love to talk about the essentials for running a horror game. So there may be people in the audience today who run horror regularly, and they're looking for tips and props on how to continue doing that. Or there might be people who are curious about running horror for the first time, or people who have tried to run horror but have found it difficult for whatever reason. So I suspect this subject will be very subjective. So what do each of us think are the essential things needed to run horror at the tabletop effectively? Like, is it a mindset? Is it props? Is it my personal thing, which is like having the right group of people involved? So let's go the other way. Maybe start with Mike and get your thoughts on this particular subject.
I mean, where to start, really? I mean, there's 101 things you could say. I think what I would say is, well, let's say two things. First of all, with a horror game, I think the essential is understanding that you can't, it can't be horrific all the time. It doesn't work. You watch a horror film, it isn't horror. It's stretches of things and then a horror. It's a stretch and then a horror. And it's the same for a game. And I see comments on forums a lot of time about, people asking how to make that game scary and kind of almost being disheartened about the fact that they couldn't, keep the horror going. It's impossible. You cannot keep the horror going. You have to build the horror. And that's what I think the essential is about understanding. It's about a building of horror, which usually means building tension, building an atmosphere that kind of generates, the right kind of ingredients to have horror, whatever that may be, happen, in the game. I think that's the real essential understanding that, you need to understand that you need to prepare and build the horror, and that it's, and the kind of the second thing, which kind of links to that, is that it's about a story. We love, throughout, before there was games, there were stories. And we're still telling stories. We're just doing it through games. And everyone, and not everyone, but most people like a horror story because it has an end. There's a real point to a horror story. There is a beginning, there is a middle, and there's a definite end with a horror story. There's normally a payoff, a twist or whatever it may be. And so I think understanding that it's about, having a story that's got a definitive kind of ending or a climax of some kind are the kind of, for me, key ingredients in terms of the essentials of, what is a horror game.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on all those points. But the ones for me that you brought up was at the beginning when you were saying that it can't be horror all the time. Definitely something to highlight is the idea of giving the players like a sense of reprieve. So they've not only got something to compare the horror to, but so they've also got something to sort of chase. Like if it's constantly horror and they've got an idea of what it's like to not be horror, it gives also the characters a reason to continue pushing forward through horrific scenarios, I find. Crystal?
So I think one of the essentials for horror that you need to tell a good story is actually having a reason for the horror. Just having someone slashing people in a park is not interesting and would not keep my interest as a role player. I would be trying to figure out why these are happening. What is the reason behind all of it? How can I stop it? What makes that aspect of the story interesting is that dive into that part of the story too. And like one of the best movies, for example, for this would be 13 Ghosts. There is a reason behind all of that. And there are some horrific scenes in that movie. But all of the ghosts all have reasons for what they are doing. And all of the humans have motivation for what they are doing as well. And I think that plays a huge part in telling a good horror story.
Yeah, it definitely always comes back to, as Mike was saying as well, the fact that we're sitting here to tell a story. And one good way I find to approach your horror on the tabletop is to pretend your table is just a campfire and you're just going back to the old school, just telling ghost stories around the campfire type thing, but a bit more interactivity. Thomas?
Yeah, no, I agree with what the others have said here. I'm just gonna, I mean, and the point about not going full horror all the time, I think is worth, really mentioning again, and just I think especially for role-playing games, I think for all horror media, even movies, you need that kind of reprieve, you need that sense of dread and these kinds of quieter moments in between. And I think for role-playing games, that's even more so, because at least in my experience, it's kind of hard in a role-playing game to have that, you can do that splatter thing, you can do that body horror, but that is very hard to do well in a role-playing game. You really need to have a game master that's really on their game to do that. But I think what's, in a sense, more effective and maybe easier in a role-playing game is to build dread and to have that kind of sense of mystery. For me, that's a more effective way than to try to kind of overwhelm players with graphic descriptions of a horrific violence or something. That can have its place, but it can quickly get old. And if you do it wrong, it'll fail completely and have the opposite effect. So I think to make a horror game effective, building dread is the key thing, and not move too fast into that really horror. Then you'll get there, but not too fast. And this is something we also touch a little bit upon in the Alien game. There's a bit about that and some GM advice on how to kind of build horror slowly and the stages of horror and so on. I think that's something to really keep in mind when running a horror game, in my experience.
Amanda, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I think we're going to talk about some of this version of my answer a little bit more in depth probably later in the panel. But for me, one of the biggest things is starting out from the right place. And when I say that, what I mean is making sure that you as the game master have a very solid idea of what type of horror it is that you want to run, what type of story you want to tell, what elements of the game you're going to bring in, and whether that's a number of different subgenres or you've got very specific things that you want to explore within the game thematically, or events that that are going to happen that will be horrific. Having a good sense of that is very important, but also having a discussion with the players and picking the people you're playing with, carefully, and making sure that that's something that they want to participate in and something that they're okay with, is really important, because then you're all sort of on the same page, that they know what to expect. And I'm not saying, give spoilers for what's exactly going to be in your game. I'm saying just categorically say there's going to be body horror in here. There are going to be, sanity draining things, or whatever it is that are your top level themes for the game, making sure that all the players, that's what they want to experience, is really important, because then everybody kind of is bought in, and it's an extension of the social contract that we all have when we play any tabletop game, which is that we're sitting down together, we're creating a story, there's a certain suspension of disbelief as things are happening within the narrative, and we're all bought in on building that story together. When you refine that down into the horror experience, I think starting out from that point is very important, so that players don't just get into something that they're not comfortable with, or that there's not something that transpires that is something that you didn't necessarily anticipate. And if something does come up and a player realizes that they're not okay with things, then they can talk to you about that, and that's a continuation of that social contract. So I think everybody sitting down and knowing we are going to play a gothic horror game where there's vampires and blood draining and it's World of Darkness or whatever it is, that's an essential part of it. And I kind of want to riff off something that Mike mentioned earlier, which is and other folks have mentioned as well, which is to pace out the horror with other stretches of types of experiences. And so when I hear that being said, I think, oh yes, that this is a tactic that I use very often as a game master, which is that you offer the PCs a little bit of hope, and you thread that within all of the horrors that are happening within the game. And maybe you snatch that away at a certain point when there is a turning point in the narrative, or maybe you insert that as a way that the PCs aren't just completely demoralized. But I really feel like that having awful things happen and then the players feeling like they have agency and like they've got some way of kind of survival of moving forward, if that's the type of game you're playing, can be really effective in keeping the game flowing and keeping it from just really devolving into people realizing, oh wow, this is really very bleak, and I'm not sure if I want to keep playing.
I wanted to ask the panel, and this, like most of the things you talk about, might be a bit polarizing, but I wanted to ask the panel about props in their games, because I've heard different things. So I personally, depending on the horror game I'm playing, do like using props. So obviously, if I'm playing Call of Cthulhu, it's a very prop-heavy game. And also, when I'm playing a game like Alien, I find the map is very integral to the suspense element of the horror in Alien. But I've heard from other people that they don't like using props in their horror game because it helps, they find it can take players out of the imaginative space, which is so integral to horror and into like our reality if you've got something tangible there. So open question, like who would like to, who's got some thoughts to share on that? Like props, how do you feel about it? Does it really depend on the game? Is it a personal touch thing?
I'll go on that one. So I love using props, but I only use props if there are some sort of story hook that I can use for it, and it's not something that my friends or anybody at the table has seen before. So like I'm not going to pull a statue off of one of my shelves that has been up there forever that, my friends have seen when they come over when we play games and stuff like that. I'm going to either print something, or I'm going to buy something and keep it set away until I'm able to use it in my story. But I usually have some sort of plot hook, or there's something on the tangible object that they have to see or feel or experience that ties into the story. It's not just there to be visual. It's there to be touched. It's there to be looked at and used and experienced, so that I don't feel that it pulls me or my local gaming group, but it might for others, and I completely respect that. But as a GM, it has to tie with the story.
Mm-hmm. I think it comes down to the style of horror game you're playing, doesn't it? I mean, some games, survival horror game or scenario, probably isn't going to be very many props that would be useful. Obviously there's a style of Call of Cthulhu that the common style is an investigation, so that tends to be kind of an information heavy kind of game. So having some of the information available on bits of paper as letters, journal entries, helps to kind of disseminate that information in a varied manner. So it's not just the keeper talking all the time, and allows the players to divulge and get into the information. I'm not personally. I'm perfectly willing to accept some people do find this. I find it difficult to understand the whole immersion thing, because at some point they're going to pick up some dice, and to me I see no difference in picking up some dice to reading a handout or whatever. You're playing a game at the end of the day. So unless you're live acting and there are no dice or mechanics and you're acting basically, then you realize you're playing a game. At some point there's going to be a game mechanic that enters that, and it's inevitable. So I'm not, I think the whole kind of immersion thing I find difficult to understand sometimes.
So the other question, unless anyone had any other thoughts on props and that kind of thing, it was something I mentioned at the top of this sort of subsection, something that a hurdle that I found personally sometimes, and I'd love to get everyone's thoughts on this. is the mindset of the players at your table. And this will probably tie in a little bit to what Amanda was talking about and to what we'll talk about when it comes to the horror contract in a moment. But I've found, and some people who have tried to run horror for maybe their group has only ever played sort of more lighthearted D&D type stuff, is that having everybody in the right mindset really helps with letting the horror do its thing. And sometimes if people are not as engaged or not as keen to that, they can really, if we approach playing a horror game in the same way as you might playing a swashbuckling game of 7th Sea, it's going to make it more difficult for the horror to seep in. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you approach maybe selling the concept of a horror game to a group of players who maybe have never really engaged with horror on the tabletop. If anyone would like to jump in first, otherwise I'll pick one of you and you'll have to speak.
I can jump in.
Thomas, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, I think that horror in RPGs it's kind of like other RPGs, only it's harder in every way to get it right. There is like a higher bar to meet to get horror to really work. And that comes in the buy-in and in kind of the atmosphere you want to build, the rules to kind of that need to support the horror, all of that. You need that in all RPGs, but I think the demands are a little bit higher for horror across the board in all of these fields. And just to get the right kind of buy-in, to an example of that, I recently played a short campaign of the Cult game, the Cult horror game, fairly recently released with one of the designers. And he was very strict. I mean, usually with my normal gaming group, we're not super strict. I sometimes wish we were a bit stricter. Sometimes we were a bit fast and loose around the table. But in this game, he was like, no. Now we're playing Cult. This is a serious horror game. There will be no cell phones anywhere. So he was very strict to get into the right mood. And he had like a theme song at the beginning of each session. And during that theme song, nobody was allowed to talk at all. We were just kind of getting into the mood of the game. And after that, it's kind of like now we're actually in the game and we're playing it. I think using small little tools like that can really help to just get your mind in the right place. And I think that can be good for all games, but for horror games, and especially like that kind of horror game, I think that can really work. But it needs the right group, because everyone has to commit. It's only if just one person just kind of falls out of that frame, it kind of falls apart. So it's not easy.
Yeah, I just want to second what Tomas said there, and that even if you are playing with players who are not used to playing horror in their tabletop RPGs, you are probably still playing with a group or a subset of your friends, and so you're going to know them at least on a superficial level. And so I would encourage game masters to pick players who like horror films, or that they enjoy horror video games, or that they're interested in the subject matter, and that they might enjoy the specific game that you're playing. So if you have a group who has only ever played, like you said, D&D, a lighthearted game or something like that, and you say, okay, I'm going to run a horror game, but you don't really articulate exactly what it is that you're trying to create, or what the differences between the genres are, and these are not necessarily people who are big horror aficionados, or they just aren't interested in another way. Like, you're going to really probably struggle with that group, and you might end up with it devolving into different Monty Python jokes or things like that, which is not what you necessarily want. So really sort of being upfront about what game you want, and if you're an experienced gamer and you have a lot of folks that you've played with, kind of picking the people who's right for that specific group is really a key to starting off on the right foot.
Crystal or Mike, have any thoughts on this, or you feel it's been covered?
I do.
Crystal? Yeah.
I actually have no hesitation in throwing horror into certain other games. So like if I have a long-running game and I want to throw a little bit of horror into like a plot that I'm running, I will run like a Scooby-Doo style horror plot with the characters that are already established with that group, and kind of give them a taste as far as what horror would be, using a game and system and characters that they're already familiar with, and just kind of either add to it, or just give them a little flavor, and then move on to continue the story, and then afterwards talk to them about, hey, if you want to run Cult, which is a very different game from many other games, or Alien RPG, that's very different from what we're running, or I can just keep throwing small little horror plots at you as this group in 7th C or D&D or anything like that. I mean, you can steal from Ravenloft all you want in D&D and use that in any D&D setting. So.
Mm-hmm. Mike, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I think what everyone has said is, spot on. But I would add, I think my number one advice, and it's, it answers most issues with role playing, is know your players. If you know your players, you know what they're going to like, what they're not going to like, what's going to push their boundaries, what's not going to push their boundaries. And obviously we're talking kind of, home groups here in terms of people you play, I guess, regularly with. Obviously, when you go to a con game, all bets are off and it's a different set of rules apply sometimes. But know your players, understand, what they're after. And because horror isn't one thing. It's a scale, like as in anything else, like fantasy, it's a scale. Is it gritty, dark fantasy? Is it high heroic fantasy, romance? Same for horror. Is it Scooby-Doo at that end? Or is it, grim, gut-wrenching, despair at the other? A game can be all these things and more, or it can focus down on one particular, section of the scale. So understanding your players, understanding what they're looking for, or what you think they may enjoy, because you can always start down that end of the scale, and you can always move it, dim the lights more as you go down that end of the scale, if you find that they are liking it and the feedback is, yeah, it's great. I thought it was going to be even more horrific than that, Mike. Could you put more horror in, please? So I think you can build it. But I think if you know your players, I mean, there are people I find it hard to believe there are people in life who don't like horror, and that's just fine. Horror games aren't for them. There are lots of other games they can play. But for those that, enjoy a bit of horror, then, that's great, because you can really, go to town.
I really like what you said there about the sliding scale, and I think once you find a game that helps work on that scale as well, it can be really good. Some of my personal favorite horror tabletop experiences are actually playing the first edition of Dark Heresy, because anyone who's familiar with the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40,000 universe will know that it sort of can lend itself to horror, but there's so many other things going on in that universe that it doesn't always have to be horrific. But even if you're not doing an automatic horrific story in that world, there's always like a looming sort of darkness, so you can really slide into it. And you're always keeping players on their toes, because essentially when you sit down to play a game like that, they're not sure really if it's going to go into the horror side of it, but they know that there's always a possibility of that. So yeah, like this, having a sliding scale is very important. So yeah, sort of what Amanda and Mike especially then was sort of touching on sort of bleeds us nicely into our next topic. Before we get into it, I just want to remind everybody, in case there's a few people that came in late, you can field any questions you may have in the Zoom chat, or by tweeting using the hashtag GenConHorror, and we may get to your question throughout the night. So we'd like to talk about the horror contract. Now, we've touched on this a little bit already, so I just want to establish for those of you who may not know, but a horror contract it's not really a hard set of rules. It really depends on group to group. That's one of the things I like to talk about here. But it's essentially the agreement that you're entering into with your players to tell the horror story, or to play the horror game, to make sure that everyone is remaining comfortable and is consenting to the themes and topics that you're going to be exploring. It's probably worth noting that in role-playing games in general, even if you're not doing a horror story, it's important to still establish, the type of game you're going to be playing, to make sure that all your players are always very comfortable with what's happening. Amanda, I might get you to kick this off, because you had some thoughts on this earlier, and I'd love to hear them expanded. So what do you believe is the best way to go about establishing a horror contract with your players?
Sure. So that session 0 that I mentioned before, I think is really important. And what is discussed in that session 0 is can be very unique to the game that's being run and to the people that you're running it for. You know, if you have strangers in your game, you're going to want to be much more cautious and err on the side of explanation of, you know, what they're going to experience in the game. And invite them to, you know, share if they have anything within, you know, those subgenres or in general that they're just not comfortable going with, and making note of that, and, you know, like shifting your plans maybe accordingly. There are a number of different various like safety tools that can be used that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And again, it just comes down to what works best for your purposes in your game. I'm going to talk about two primary ones that are in use pretty frequently. One is called lines and veils, and the other is the X card. So for those who might not be familiar, lines and veils is a pretty simplistic system in which there is a way of categorizing content that players might experience in the game. And so there are some things that players might say they're okay with happening, but they don't want it to be described in a graphic fashion at the table. And so that would be something that you would draw a veil over as the game master. Say there's a couple players who are really not okay with really gross graphic descriptions of like bodily mutilation. So if you have something where that happens in the game, there's a big monster and the players come across that monster like ripping apart a person. Well, instead of describing that in great graphic detail, you could just draw a veil over it and say, you see something awful happening to this person and there's no way they could have survived it. We're just going to draw a veil over that. What do you guys want to do? And then there's a line, which is there might be some content that some players just say, absolutely not. A common one might be no rape in the game. I absolutely don't want rape to happen. So that's something that you know up front and you can just not include in the game. And it's you know, it's very good for sort of like broad categories of like, there's stuff that is a hard stop for me, and then there's some stuff that makes me kind of uncomfortable, but I understand it's horror. So, you know, that might happen, but it might not be super graphic. The X card is another pretty simple tool that is actually something that can be used continuously throughout all sessions. It's literally a postcard that just has an X on it, and you have it in the middle of the table. And if there's ever something that happens within the game where a player just goes, oh, wow, that's not okay, like I'm not okay with that, then they can just touch the card, and you as the game master don't need to, you know, have any explanation. You can just call for a quick break, or you can just pivot from whatever it is that's happening and go to a different scene, or have another player, you know, talk about what they're doing. It's just like a quick visual indication that something has started to go wrong, and it's a tool for you as the game master to not accidentally continue down that path. So, you know, again, just kind of being open and upfront with your players about what it is that they want to experience can really kind of help you be guided toward one of those systems if either of them are appropriate for you.
Thomas, your thoughts?
No, I think those are really good tools to use for this, and I actually think that, I mean, you might think there is some kind of a conflict here between, because horror is supposed to make you to some extent uncomfortable, or put you in some kind of position that of something unexpected, something scary, something that kind of puts you out of your comfort zone to some extent. So. But I actually think having done that, what Amanda just described before, I think will actually help that, not hinder it, because then you kind of, you know, your baseline, and then you can kind of totally commit once you've done that. You don't have to kind of feel that you might wander into something that you're really not okay with. So I think that actually will actually, at least to my experience, can help the feeling of horror at the table rather than hinder it. So I think that's really good.
Crystal?
Yeah, I use the X card a lot, especially when I run games at conventions, usually because they're very quick. It's a very quick explanation. It's very easy to use. I've never actually had it touched when I've run horror games. But you know, when I'm gaming with people that I don't know, I tend to not pull as many punches as if I would with my friends. Because I know my friends very well. But I think that a lot of people tend to forget that when you put up those walls, those hard stops in those areas, you have still this whole huge room to fill. So you actually get more creative with the things that you are doing and the story that you are telling when you put those hard stops in place. And you can actually tell a better story for everybody when you have those restrictions in place. Whether it's, lines and veils, X card, safety mechanics, or even just the genre of story you're telling. What genre of horror are you doing? Are you doing suspense? Are you doing body horror? Are you doing something else? Making sure that you stay within those restrictions, and you will have a much better story because it'll be a lot cleaner and you'll get a lot more creative with what you have.
Also, just on the X card, I wanted to clarify something because I was running a bunch of convention games here in Australia for Vampire earlier in the year, and we used the X card. And one of my storytellers sort of said at the end of the first day, he said, "Oh, I don't think I did things very well in my games today." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Oh, nobody ever touched the X card." And I was like, "No, that's a good thing." So, while yes, someone is supposed to touch the X card when they're uncomfortable and they want to move on, that's not your goal. You don't want to get to that point. No, you're not trying to, because he I think misunderstood it a little bit in terms of, you're not constantly trying to hit a ceiling to find where it is. You're trying to make sure everyone is comfortable. Mike, you touched a bit on this in the last subject. Is there anything you'd like to expand upon?
I'm just trying to think. I mean, I think it does come down to having that conversation with your players before a game begins, explaining what the nature of the game or the scenario or campaign that you are, looking for, for them that they want to play, and explaining that, it is a horror game, and if people don't, understand what that means, then obviously having a conversation around what that means for you as the GM in terms of, where this is a game where, it's going to feature death, it's going to feature murder, it's going to feature crime, etc., and going to feature, unbelievable horrors from beyond the dimensions, whatever it may be. And as Thomas said, a pretty essential ingredient of horror is that kind of finding oneself out of one's comfort zone. But again, it's a scale. It's not, throwing you in a cold bath to, shock you. It's a scale, and there are degrees of discomfort in the game, and some of them, a lot of people are quite happy to be slightly discomforted, not necessarily completely scared witless, as it were. So understanding that, and at the end of the day, it's the game. It's a game, and if I need to explain that, there's something wrong with it, but it's a game. So, it isn't, you aren't putting yourself, voluntarily into being, terrified witless as a real person. You are experiencing fun. And, for some people, horror is fun, but the reason is because it's a safe environment to enjoy that horror. We're not actually walking in the woods or in the middle of my local town at 12 o'clock on a Friday night when the pub's closed. It's a safe environment to explore, themes of horror, and it's working out what themes people are happy and comfortable, playing in the game with.
One thing that I've sometimes heard come up as a concern from newer GMs or players when it comes to establishing a horror contract is the fear of spoiling the story, or so if you say at the top of your game that I just want to check, is everybody okay with body horror, and then everyone says, "Oh yeah, that's great, I love body horror." Are you at a danger of being like, "Wow, I wish I hadn't told you all that I was going to do body horror, whatnot"? Is there because obviously we still have to make sure that everyone's comfortable with their topics. Is just an open question to the panel. Is there a creative way any of you have found to go about establishing these consent and agreements with everybody while also maintaining a sense of suspense and not spoiling any aspects of your own story?
I can jump in if nobody wants to.
Amanda? Yes? Sorry, I was muted.
Sure. So I think that you can tread a very fine line between content notes, basically content warnings, and actual specific spoilers. So that's why you might categorically say, I've got, I've got this sort of thing planned. I've got a psychological game planned in which you might question your reality, right? Or I've got a psychological game planned where you, may lose your memory and, things have happened to you that you don't understand or remember and things like that. You don't necessarily have to give the specific details of, oh, there's going to be, somebody mind controlling somebody else. You don't have to give the spoilers for what your big payoff is. You can sort of categorically lead them in that direction. And then, as you get there and as you work toward that big reveal, you will get a better sense of how people are receiving your game. And I also think that there's a general understanding of people who play tabletop RPGs that player knowledge and character knowledge are not the same thing. So even if you might slip a little bit on the side of a minor spoiler, that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't have as much of an effect in game, because the characters and the players won't know the specific context of when that's coming up. And, even if they can kind of figure it out, the character, that's still the thing happening to the character, and the player doesn't necessarily need to apply that player knowledge to what the character is doing. So in that way, spoilers are a little bit less of a concern, as long as you kind of point out, like, look, just because you as a player suspect that something is going to happen doesn't mean that your character has any idea that's going to happen. So just reminding folks can be helpful in that case.
Anyone else thoughts on that? Mike, yes?
I just wanted to throw in one side from the other side of the GM screen. I think, particularly the role-playing games historically, there's a lot of onus put on, the GM. They're the ones who've got to have this conversation with the players at the start. They're the ones who've got to get the X card out. They're the ones who've got to kind of, give an outline of the play. And that's all cool. And that's what we all do. However, it is as much the player's responsibility to inform the group and the GM about what their expectations may or may not be, or if they've got a concern, to be able to feel comfortable to raise that either in the group or one-to-one or on an email with the keeper before the game starts or whatever, just to help steer things. Players have a responsibility. It is their game as well. The GM isn't there to entertain the players around the table in that style. It's a group game. Everyone's playing it together, and I think we sometimes forget that players have a responsibility to help shape the game as well.
Yeah, I think one of the best tools you can use, which is something I use a lot, particularly if I'm starting a new campaign or if I'm working with a group of players who I don't know as well, is to get all the players to anonymously fill out this form called the RPG consent checklist. If you just Google RPG consent checklist, you can find it there. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I believe it was Monte Cook Games that put it out originally. I may be incorrect on that. It was? Yes, I mean, I think you're very good. Yeah. And that'll make it very clear to you as the GM what you can and cannot do with this group of players, and the fact that you can sort of keep it anonymous. No one's going to be sort of self-conscious about, saying what they are not comfortable with. The other thing that is very helpful are games that actually find a way to build this into their mechanics. So, Thomas mentioned Cult earlier, which is a game that I like a lot, and it is also a lot. There are a lot of things in that game. There's a lot, but one of the things that I think that game does particularly well is it builds in this very clear-cut version of lines and veils that Amanda was talking about into the mechanics of the game, and very much encourages you to cut that off where you can. And like the current edition of Vampire the Masquerade has a mechanic called your chronicle tenets, which you as a group decide on what your chronicle tenets are. And while this mechanically will affect how your characters maintain their humanity, What it really does is establishes the moral backbone of the story you're going to tell, and it keeps you all in line with this is what we are okay with while we are playing as monsters. So there are definitely tools out there. So stemming off from that, I would love to talk about the mechanics of monsters and the mechanics of horror. So while we can certainly tell horror stories and play horror games in games that are not designed for horror, I believe there's an extra element that makes the gamification of our horror even better when you're playing a game that was designed with horror in mind. So I'm talking, of course, about the sanity mechanic in Call of Cthulhu, or the corruption mechanic in Dark Heresy, the hunger mechanic in Vampire, and the panic dice system in Alien. So I suppose what I'd like to hear from the panel is one, how essential do you feel these things are to have? Would you always, if your players wanted to play a horror game, would you first sort of steer them away from injecting horror into what you're already doing, so you have access to these mechanics? And two, if you are playing a horror game that has these dedicated mechanics, how do you go about utilizing them? Is there a danger of over or underusing these things? So it might start with Thomas. I'd love to hear more about the panic dice mechanic in Alien, which I think is so quintessential to that experience, but also just in general how you feel about mechanics that reinforce horror and suspense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a key thing and a tricky balance with doing horror. I mean, you need that sense of suspense and immersion. You need that in all RPGs, but I think particularly for horror games. And that can be a balance to strike between that and rules in general. I mean, so I think for horror games particularly, you don't want them to be very rules heavy. I mean, I think most good horror games tend to be rules light. And that's at least the kind of idea. But then you also want some kind of key mechanic that reinforces the horror or that particular type of horror story that the game is designed to tell. So I think Call of Cthulhu does that really well with the sanity mechanic. It's kind of like the key thing. The rest of the mechanics are fine too, but I think the sanity mechanic is the kind of that you keep in mind. And I think we tried to do a similar thing in a way with the stress and panic mechanics in Alien, is that to have the rest of the game fairly scaled down. In that kind of rules engine that we use, this is probably the most rules light version, or yeah, maybe there is another one pretty close to it, but it's definitely rules light, and the focus is on the stress mechanic so that the other stuff doesn't get in the way. I mean, there is rules for other things as well, but they're toned down, scaled down, so that the key horror mechanic that we're going for can really take take the stage, and that's where the focus will be. And even doing so, I think another thing is that even that core mechanic needs to be fairly simple, easy to grasp, so that you can keep the immersion going and the flow of the game going, and that the rules doesn't stop you all the time. So I think that's also one of the ideas within the stress mechanic in Alien, is to add these stress dice. It's a very simple visual and tactile simulation of that building tension. You get these dice that keep building, and you know that eventually you will crack. It's only a question of when. And that I think finding something, I mean, that's what we tried to do, to find some kind of fairly simple but meaningful mechanic that kind of reinforces the theme of the game, and then keep everything else fairly scaled down. I mean, at least that was the whole idea behind the Alien rules, the way they look.
Crystal?
I love the hunger dice system from Vampire the Masquerade. I believe that it was a great addition to move away from just a pool of blood, and instead now you are continually battling against your beast to do anything. And every time you roll the dice, you take a chance on losing it. And I think that adds so much horror to that game, personal horror, because you could just be talking to a dude on the street and lose it. And now you have a mess to clean up. And I absolutely love that. As a game designer, I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I really love visual stuff as well. So watching you add more dice to, more hunger dice to your rolls, or with the chill mechanic, where you flip over the tokens back and forth between the GM and the players, was a fantastic visual where, you're flipping more and more over to get more stuff done, but you're coming to the end and that big bag monster has not shown up yet. And now he has all of these tokens to use against us, is a fantastic visual suspense that I absolutely love. So yeah, visual stuff, mechanic stuff, I think are almost as essential as the storytelling and descriptions and role playing around the horror story.
Mike?
Well, you mentioned sanity. I mean, Cthulhu is often, called out for the sanity mechanic, that basically models the kind of behavior of the protagonists in the fiction on which, kind of inspires the game, that kind of, early 20th century kind of weird fiction and horror fiction. It's about a kind of when the human mind is touched by the other, the inhuman, the cosmic, it has this kind of corrupting effect, and that's what the sanity kind of mechanic models in the game. But I think there are other mechanics in the game that support the horror as well. I don't think it's just one mechanic that does that in Call of Cthulhu. Pushing the role in Call of Cthulhu is very much about whilst giving players agency to basically make a second attempt at a role to achieve a goal. They do so with the full knowledge that if they fail that role, they give the keeper permission to increase the horror, to increase the threat against them, to increase the stakes, basically. And so that mechanic in itself helps to build tension, because when roles get vital, when there's a really vital role, there is a real kind of decision whether they're going to push the role, because they know that the outcome could make things far, far worse. So that kind of supports the kind of general kind of horror play of the game. And things like luck spending as well, the optional luck spending rule, which mirrors sanity in that it's a downward spiral for the character. But it's done by the players. It's about giving the players enough rope to hang their own characters, really. That they get player agency, but there is a bad return for it. Their character will fare worse by things happening for them now. At the end, nearer the climax, or when it really counts, they will be in a less fit state to deal with that as characters. So I think all these things kind of work to combine that, and then you have the kind of the backstory kind of mechanics in Call of Cthulhu that instants in the game can actually the keeper can corrupt a character's backstory, whereas before they may have a strong relationship with someone, you can corrupt that relationship through the game, or a relationship with a location or a belief or whatever it may be. Again, that all builds in. And so I guess the reason I kind of labor these other mechanics is because there's a preconception that it's just sanity. And actually there's a lot of mechanics that support horror gameplay in Call of Cthulhu. They're very easy to use, they're very simple ones, but they plug in at a very fundamental level in terms of how to help build tension and drive the story forward, which is what these mechanics are really all about.
I'll get to Amanda in one moment. I was gonna just poke over to Thomas, because there's a pushing the role mechanic in Free League games as well, but also in Alien, correct? Is that what you were going to bring up? Sorry.
Yeah, pretty much. I think, Mike I completely agree. And I think that's really worth underscoring, that kind of giving, it's a particularly useful mechanic. I like it in all games, but horror games, it works really well to give agency to players, just like Mike described, but at a cost, because that's a really good way to build tension, to give, yeah, you can do this, but it's going to cost you. And that building that tension, I mean, that's part of the stress mechanic in Alien, is also that the way it works generally is that, just simplified, is that when you make a roll, you can push the roll, but then you'll get the stress die. So you will, it's exactly that kind of mechanic, that principle that also Mike touched upon, that you get the chance of another chance to succeed, you can increase your chances, you give more agency, but it will cost you later down the line, because it will increase your stress, your tension, and that's going to explode at some point. I think the kicker in Alien is that until you reach that point, you actually get better, because those stress dice are actually useful. So the more stressed you are, that you get actually sharper until you break. But that's kind of a twist to the general principle. And yeah, like you mentioned, actually the push mechanic is in basically all of our games in some form or another. And I think, and I mean, we don't only do horror games, but so I think in general, it's a really great way of just giving that kind of extra agency at a cost, that you always have that chance. Do you want to push forward, but it's going to cost you either right now or later on. It's like in Coriolis, a sci-fi game that has a kind of a Cthulhian sense of cosmic horror as well, even though it's a sci-fi game. When you push a roll there, you give, like, they're called darkness points to the game master, that the game master can then use for various effects down the line. So you know that you're giving power to the darkness, or to some kind of the dark between the stars in that game. So I think these kinds of mechanics that kind of increase tension, just like Mike described, you have them, of course, in Call of Cthulhu also, are really great tools for creating suspense and horror.
Amanda?
Yeah, no, I really just want to echo what Thomas and Mike were saying about systems that involve pressing your luck in a horror environment. That's a type of system that I really enjoy, and I feel like those types of mechanical systems are really what separates horror that's been injected into a game not meant for it, versus a game that specifically sets out to be a horror experience that you're specifically running to produce a horrific effect for your players. And so I'm just going to mention a game that I played a campaign of not too long ago called Blades in the Dark, which has a very similar push your luck style mechanic, in which you can, it's entirely subjected to the game master, but your character can push themselves to try to accomplish something that might be unlikely given the scenario, and you can accumulate stress points. And there's a mechanic in between scenes where you can indulge in your vice to reduce your stress points, but there's a die roll that's involved. And so the more the game progresses, depending on the way that the dice bounce, it really sort of just builds in the extra sense of my character's tolerance for these horrible things that have been happening in the game is really getting pushed to its limits. And so now, how much do I want to gamble with the negative effects of having all of this stress, versus my hope that pushing myself and giving myself extra dice to roll in this case will help me solve this problem, or will help sort of like move the story forward in a positive way for us and not backfire on us. So I just really think that that's a great thing to engage with and to be creative with as game master within a mechanic that really reinforces the type of experience and the suspense and the dread that you're trying to build with your game in the first place.
So I wanted to ask an open question to the panel. Do you feel that these mechanics are essential to your tabletop horror experience, or if you were playing a game that wasn't traditionally geared toward horror mechanically, would you be looking at trying to introduce some of these mechanics to, say, if you were playing a game of D&D or Pathfinder or 7th Sea or something like that, which doesn't have these horror mechanics that we're talking about, would you just go with the flow of the story and the narrative to create your horror atmosphere, or would you prefer to either switch systems or to introduce some new mechanics to try to drive that home? So it's open question. So thoughts, anyone? Crystal?
I can go first. So it depends on the story that I want to tell. For like, I would, if I were playing a D&D and introducing horror, I'd probably switch to a more narrative approach with telling the horror. Also knowing that with my D&D group, my players will torture themselves way more than I can ever come up with. And so I will just dangle something in front of them and let them paw at it for a while. But I'm also not afraid to incorporate different types of mechanics, whether it's behind the screen where the players may not actually know that it's happening, but it's more narrative for me, or giving them something tangible that they would have to complete, like doing a puzzle in a certain amount of time, where they have to complete the puzzle in order to be able to solve, stop the thing from happening, or whatever the case might be, and adding some sort of tangible, well, it may not be strictly mechanical, there is a time limit, or there's something set up where there is a fail point, and then stuff happens.
Anyone else on that one before we move on?
I mean, I think horror can be effective when you run it in a system that's not intentionally meant for it. And a lot of the bigger systems, D&D, but I'm thinking about first edition Pathfinder in specific, and to some extent Starfinder as well, they've got little subsystems that do allow you to plug and play certain things. So there's a whole hardcover called Horror Adventures that's got a number of different subsystems. There's a corruption subsystem that allows you, if there's a character that's got some kind of connection to some like dark force, whether it's diabolic or whether it's demonic in nature, or some sort of disease or something like that, narratively different things kind of happen as that character progresses along that corruption. And so if you use something like that, or if you use, there are other types of, like, there's a madness mechanic that's involved there, really kind of like look for the tools that already exist within these bigger systems to see what might be most appropriate for your game, or come up with something that is maybe on your own, like maybe there's, a percentile roll or a table for random events that can happen that can, affect the characters while they're trying to go about their different goals, or that things that are random occurrences are slowly revealing what is intended to be sort of your horror reveal later on. I don't think that you can't run horror in a game that's not meant for it. I just think you kind of have to put some thought into mechanics that do maybe exist that will help you, or ways that you can reinforce the fact that this isn't just a normal dungeon crawl, there's something weird that's going on here, and what are ways that your characters are experiencing that. Those are good questions to ask yourself.
Well, we've had some. We've got a few minutes left, and we've had some great questions come through both on Twitter and through the Zoom chat. So I'd encourage anyone who might have a question that's pop up to send those through. And these are just going to be open questions again, so whoever would like to jump in, hopefully generate some conversation. The one I'd like to start with came from at JamH27James on Twitter. They said, I find horror RPGs lend themselves well to moral dilemma situations. Does the panel have any tips or ideas for developing these during a session? I personally really love moral dilemmas. I like getting the players to ask themselves and also their characters what is the right or wrong thing to do in any given situation, specifically, if it's not particularly clear cut. And I think horror also lends itself a lot to these kind of questions. In Stephen King's book on writing, he talks about the importance of introducing a moral dilemma early on in any sort of horror story. So yeah, we'd like to hear anyone's thoughts on who would like to jump in on how to effectively build or develop a moral dilemma or moral situation in your horror story.
Yeah, I can
Mike?
go somewhere for that way. I think I would hesitate to advise anyone to do it on the fly in the middle of a game, unless the stars truly are right and everything aligns perfectly by kind of random chance of the game. I think it's quite difficult to concoct a moral dilemma, because that's what we're actually talking about, is you need to construe what is a moral dilemma for your characters and the setting and within the context of the the scenario campaign that they may be playing. And that's often not a quick 1 minute thought. That does often require a bit of pre-thought between games to think how can I kind of engineer events to kind of push the players down a certain direction, so they are faced with this moral dilemma. Because ultimately, what you're talking about is, which we're going to have to make a choice, and both choices are bad. Which one is not as bad as the other? And sometimes, they are equally as bad, and it just comes down to what the players, want to do, or inspires them to try and find a third way to kind of, try and save the day, as it were. But I think those kind of real gripping, where the players are kind of debating, and it takes most of the night because they're really at the heart of this kind of matter. They require thought, and I would advise to really think about how that might happen. But and as I say, you want to try and engineer it to move forward to it, but equally sometimes you don't want to force it too much. You want to kind of let it come naturally almost. It's that kind of strange thing. You've got to kind of plan and engineer it, but then you've got to kind of let it breathe and almost, let it come upon the players as if you're not imposing it. Because obviously, players will rail if they think you've just made this up and to make their lives hard, and it won't have the same effect. You've got to almost let it become the player's idea. So my advice is it's a great thing. You can't do it all the time, and you really need to think about how you're going to make this happen, because it plays off the group. And again, I'll go back to it and I'll say it again, know your players. If you know your players, you'll know what maybe the buttons are in terms of what could be a difficult choice for them, in terms of how that might work. It's not an easy answer, but it's not an easy question.
Anyone else on the importance of moral dilemmas and such?
Just one thing that came to mind when Mike was talking here is that I feel for horror games particularly that I think one-shot games tend to work better, at least for me, because it's in a campaign game where the characters are supposed to continue playing with other adventures down the line, they kind of can reduce the level of tension in horror because the stakes are maybe a bit lower. And I think that ties into the idea of a moral dilemma, because in a one-shot game, you can put everything on the line. And that moral dilemma, in the end, that final choice can be so definitive. It can define the characters' lives, whether they live or die, whatever. It can be everything is on the line, which is much harder to do in a campaign game. So I think, at least in my experience, getting that moral dilemma really to kick in fully has mostly been the case in one-shots for me.
If I could just add on to the end of that, Thomas, because I agree with you completely. The difference I would say is I think it's easier to create in a one-shot. I completely agree with you, but I think it has far more effect in the campaign when you've got a character that the player has really bought into over a length of time. And I think they both do it, but I think in slightly different ways.
Amanda, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to echo Tomas and Mike and say, I think that moral dilemmas need to have room to breathe, and they really need to have the weight and the importance of them assigned to them, whether that's, it's the thing that happens at the end of the one shot, or, it's the thing that happens early on and then the decision has to be made later on. It's really important to kind of let the players realize what decision they have to make, and potentially be able to create a third situation, as you mentioned so astutely there, Tomas, and really let them kind of sit with it and think about what is actually happening here, what's being asked of me, what are the implications of these things, and really allow that weight to kind of settle down and be as affecting as it can be. Because if you're doing these multiple moral dilemmas, boom, 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 all one after the other, it's very easy to become desensitized to that as a player. And so that kind of undermines what your goal as the game master is, which is to create that thinking, sort of like very deep kind of experience that you can really get into when you go into one moral dilemma that's been used properly.
So the next question we have is one that people might think is a bit cut or dry, but I go back and forth between it, and I'd love to know the panel's thoughts on it. It comes from Mr. Shiny from the Zoom chat. They ask quite simply, do you think miniatures can be used effectively in horror games? Thomas, you're nodding. I think.
Yeah, actually, not really. So no, I mean, not to my experience. I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but to my, it's not something that I've been. I mean, it depends on what kind of horror you're doing, though. That's why I'm kind of conflicted on it, because like in Alien, the map is actually key, and moving on the map, because you that kind of exploration into whatever some derelict spaceship or wherever you are, that's really part of the experience. And having these, I mean, the game doesn't come with miniatures, but there are counters for like movement sensor pings where you think something is moving, and then using that kind of tools, and you could use miniatures for that. That works. But for in another type of game, like Vaesen that I mentioned, of Gothic horror, I think I would have a hard time using miniatures in an effective way. So for me, it really depends on the type of horror, the type of game. Not a very clear-cut answer, but that's the best I got.
I have got an answer answer if you want it very quickly.
Of course, Mike.
I don't use miniatures in Call of Cthulhu. I agree with Thomas. I don't find they help my game, but I think I can see some people might find it useful. I have used miniatures once in Call of Cthulhu. It was during a campaign, and the players were going to start this next session, basically running headlong into this massive kind of cult ritual. So I spent a few hours before they all turned up setting up the temple. I put 300 miniatures on there just to kind of, they were all sorts of miniatures, whatever I could find, as all these cultists. I put a big cloth over it and then waited for the players to come. And they said, so are you going in? Yeah, we're going in. And then revealed it to show them just the sheer scale of what they were running into, to kind of create the effect of going like, oh my, I didn't realize there was that many of them. And it just but it was purely for that effect. But other than that, I haven't really used them either.
Amanda or Crystal, thoughts on miniatures in horror games? Can they be effective?
I completely agree that it depends on the game. But I also feel that if you are really good at kit bashing and making your own minis or creating your own miniatures or something like that, out of whatever spare parts you have from everything, or even drawing, 3D rendering, anything like that, that is definitely having a visual at the right moment is good. If you're hunting something that's horrific and you show them the mini like the first 5 minutes into the game, you lose all the mystique of what's happening. You have to reveal what is happening and what you see at the right moment if you are going to use the mini.
So another great question from over on Twitter, coming from at Kindeye Games. Can you give a specific example of a truly chilling, disturbing, or thrilling moment in one of your horror games and why it was so effective? What is a takeaway in terms of advice? I would imagine most of us should have at least one example of this. Mike, I'd hate for you have to use your 300-piece miniature diorama as another example, but think of a particularly chilling or thrilling moment and why was it so effective. If you're thinking, I can probably go first here because it sort of ties into some of the things we were talking about before, but in the tail end of the first edition Dark Heresy campaign I ran a few years ago, we'd built up a whole, we had these very well-established characters, and there was this ongoing war between the idea of radical inquisitorship and heretical inquisitorship and Puritan inquisitorship and all that such. And there was a moment where we got to pose that very, very stressful, horror-y moral dilemma to the players, to the point where it was, I'm not exaggerating, it was about an hour of the players sitting around being really unsure of what to do. And it just really echoes sort of what Mike was saying, that it is very, very effective if you can get the moral question correct for the players and the characters in a campaign after so long. And I think it was, there's sort of a combination of a lot of the things we've been talking about, and that's why that moment was so effective. So that's my one, I would say. Yeah. Nobody has a scary moment that they thought was good.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Amanda?
I mean, I can tell stories about games all day, so I don't want to just sit here and take up all of the airspace. I had a moment. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, Crystal, go. It's all right.
I actually had a moment where, as a GM, I made a mistake, and it turned into a completely horrific scene that we didn't realize for months later, because it was actually the introduction to my D&D game. I had them doing like little side quests, and I meant to have them hunt owl bears, and instead said bugbears, which are humanoids, and they had to collect the skins off of these creatures. So they were getting humanoids, which after figuring out that I was having them skin these humanoids, there were in-character repercussions from it, including a bugbear union, because they're also sentient. But like you can take mistakes and run with them and make them horrific, because that was, I turned my D&D characters, who are all some form of good or lawful, into Ed Gein by accident, and not one of the players actually questioned it. So like, if the players didn't question it, I assume the characters didn't, and didn't have an issue with it. And so that also plays up again into like morality and stuff like that too. So, as the players figured out what they did, that sort of started to weigh on them as well. So.
Amanda, did you have one you wanted to share?
Yeah, I really enjoy, I think Tomas mentioned this before, but I really enjoy horror one-shots, because I really feel like that the amount of things you can accomplish within a one-shot is sort of exponential, because horror always has a specific pace to it, and then once you've gone through that pace and you've gotten to the end and the denouement and the falling action and stuff, like, it's really hard to try to expand past that. So it's fun for me to run shorter one-shots or two-shots, and I run a lot of convention games, and I had one from Gen Con of last year, in fact, in which it was a con game, but I was running it for some pretty close friends, and we were running a game called Dread, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a pretty rules-light game. It uses a Jenga tower. It's all about suspension, and every time a character is taking an action that's outside of what they would reasonably be able to do given their gears and their ability, they pull a brick, and if the tower falls over, that character either dies in a horrific way in that moment, or you as the GM can hold that back and figure out a very cinematic or very satisfying way that character dies. And in most games of Dread, almost all the characters die, and there's maybe one survivor. But I was running a scenario in which the characters were really just supposed to go from A to B. They were taking something to a manor, and they had to pass through this creepy, spooky woods, and there was a little bit of a subplot about a doctor who was supposed to be there with them, but he hadn't showed up on time, and they had to leave without him. And one of them was the guy's sister, and so there was a little bit of like concern about what's going on. And as they're progressing through the woods, they're finding more and more things are off, and it turns out that there's a graveyard that they're going past, and something happens and the wagon breaks down, so they've got to go, get supplies to repair the wagon, and they're finding out that the graves have been disturbed. And then they continue to go on, and they find out that there have been some graves that have been exhumed, and there are strange things that happen, and zombies end up coming, and they come upon this little caretaker shack. And as they open the door, I in a very floored way in describing what they see, and it turns out that there's a zombie with an arm missing, a zombie with a leg missing, there was like a headless zombie, and I basically described this giant zygote flesh golem that is just revealed in this horrible way, and it turns out the doctor is basically Victor Frankenstein. But as I'm like going through the woods and all of these like strange things are kind of popping up, there were a number of people who were spectating this horror event, and as if they're all like, oh, what is all this, what is this about with the graves being open, and like what kind of horrible thing are they going to find? Then when when I described the opening of the door and seeing, you know, the terrible flesh golem experiment that has roared to life and is ripping apart the doctor as soon as the door is open, the spectators just go, oh my god, because they weren't expecting it to be that huge of a thing. But that was, you know, that's an example of where like building that tension and dropping hints here or there that aren't super obvious about what it's going to be was really an effective way for the players to kind of experience, you know, that reveal, and for people to see how, you know, subtlety can really build up to like a 10 or an 11 at the very end when that reveal happens. So that was a fun, effective way that I got to be like really gross and graphic because they were my friends. And people who knew us were stopping by and watching, and it was a really fun time. It was a good horror game.
One last very simple question before we wrap up came from Breeden in the chat. What is each panelist's favorite horror RPG or setting? Crystal?
Oh,
Okay.
of course. I have to go with Vampire the Masquerade. It was my very first, and getting to add my voice to that world has been amazing, and I think it will always continue to be my baby.
Thomas?
Well, it's kind of hard. I mean, having recently created a horror game, it's kind of the, you know, it's the game, the horror game I always wanted. It's the one I kind of made. So at the moment, you know, Alien, but historically, or going, you know, through Call of Cthulhu was the horror game that probably meant the most to me in the early days of role playing, and it continues to be an awesome game. So that also holds a very special place in my role playing heart.
Amanda?
Wow, oh my gosh, I love so many of those games, and I really hate to copy Crystal, but Vampire the Masquerade and the Old World of Darkness was really my first like actual horror game that was meant to be a horror game. So I think I have to pick that one because putting myself in the shoes of the monster for the first time was a very formative early experience for me, and it turns out that I love playing the monster now, and in video games I always want to play the monster. So I think I'm going to pick Vampire the Masquerade just for the richness of that setting and the aesthetic that really appeals to me, and just the customization of different clans of vampires that you can pick. And I got to plug Gangrel for life because I do love my feral, you know, forest-dwelling vampires.
Mike?
I don't know. I've never really played much horror. Well, obviously, I'm kind of partial to Call of Cthulhu, but that's you know, everyone knows that already. So I'm going to say two other games as well as Call of Cthulhu. I think what Thomas has done with Alien is fantastic. I think it's a really nice system. It really kind of does what it's meant to do, and Alien's one of my all-time favorite films. So why wouldn't I love a game about it? One that maybe not so many people have heard about, because my other love is kind of that kind of 50s B horror film kind of stuff. So a game, I don't even know if it's still in print. It came from the Late Show, which is all about B-movie horror. That's a great game to check out if you can find it.
For me, I mean, I like so many horror games that I constantly change depending on my mood. I'm obsessed with Alien at the moment, and when my Vaesen arrives in the mail later today, I'm probably going to be obsessed with that for a little while. But I really have to acknowledge my origins, and for me, it's going to be Vampire the Requiem. I was like, because without that game, not to sound too hyperbolic, but I would not be where I am in my life and in my career if I didn't pick up that game back when I was a teenager. So we're about to wrap up. Thank you for everybody for joining us from wherever you are in the world. I've been Brian Holland. You can find me on Twitter at BWHolland. I'll just get each of the panelists to just go around and just remind everyone who they are and where they can be found online if they would like to be. Amanda?
Hi, so I'm Amanda Hamon. I'm the editorial director for Kobold Press, and you can find me on Twitter at Amanda Hamon. That's Hamon.
Crystal?
I'm Crystal Mazur. You can find me at Twitter at bodyandsoul152 or on Instagram at the same name. And I do have a Facebook page. You can follow and like it there. And I do have a website. It's called thegeekypanda.com, where you can get everything that I've written for is on there.
Thomas?
Yeah, Tomas Harenstam from Free League. I'm not that big personally, but so really, if you want to follow what we're doing, Free Leagues is obviously on Facebook and Twitter. It's the Swedish one. We're stuck with it, so it's Fria Ligan, FRIALIGAN, on both Facebook and Twitter. You can find us there.
Mike?
You can find me on Twitter at Mike Mason. But you're more likely to hear about what I'm doing day to day in terms of Call of Cthulhu and horror at chaosium.com and the Chaosium Facebook page and Twitter account. Please just follow us there.
All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your Gen Con. We can't wait to see you throughout the con in whatever form that takes, be it at a game or at another panel. So thanks so much, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.